In Flanders Field, that poem truly is a passionate and great anti-war poem. It was crafted by Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, a Canadian who fought in Flanders Fields in Belgium, and one of the things he experienced there was the first chemical attack of a war ever. The Germans used chlorine gas on the French positions that were just north of where John was stationed with the other Canadians. This was in 1915, but they weren't able to break through. He was a medic. That was his job. And he describes that period of his life and the life of our nation and our world as 17 days and nights of continuous gunfire. He said he took his clothes off maybe twice in that 17-day period, and he said he was overwhelmed with the dead, the wounded, and the absolutely terrified. That was the war that was supposed to end all wars, and today we have 69 conflicts happening around the world as we worship together. Now, we in Canada can take some pride that we're one of the most peaceful nations in that sense on earth, but we also spend as much as many other countries. In fact, we're one of the top 14 in terms of military spending. What does that look like? It looks like about $32 billion a year federally, which is 10 times as much as we spend on housing, 10 times as much as we spend on health care. Now, I know when I look out at you that I'm looking out at just about everyone who's been touched by war at some point in their family's history. My own uncle was one of the troops that liberated Auschwitz. He was never the same again. And of course, we Canadians are part of the war effort in that horror that is Yemen as we speak. My children's dad, who died in 1992, was a draft resistor, an American from Chicago. He arrived in Canada when he was 17 years old, imagine that. But there was absolutely no division between what he felt and what the other boys that he grew up with, who were drafted or who enlisted willingly, felt. There was never any animosity between them. They were all of one voice and one accord that that war needed to end. One of his good friends decided to enlist, thinking that maybe he would get a better position. He asked the recruiter if he could get a job in the army band. He ended up in the jungle as an infantry person, came back with a very serious heroin habit. We stopped that war. We did around the world. We did. Here's the thing. Let's say it unequivocally. One can be supportive of our veterans and our soldiers and those who fought and died. We can be completely supportive of them and still be peace activists. Whether we believe in the theory of a just war or we're pacifists, we can do both. There is no contradiction. We, all of us, of course, should be of one mind in stopping the bloodshed from ever recurring. In this Sunday of hope, and it is a Sunday of hope, we can also point to a few miracles. It's an absolute miracle that we have not used nuclear weapons since the Second World War. It's a miracle. Overall, the number of people who die in nation-to-nation conflict has gone down since World War II. That's a miracle. It's 30 years this week since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and there was a time in our history that we thought that would never happen without a war. Another miracle. But the miracle, the greatest miracle for our we people of faith is this one. Death has no dominion over us. So let's talk about resurrection. And trust me, it's not a topic you hear progressive faith people talk about often. Let's talk about heaven. Let's talk about resurrection. We are a resurrection people. And remember that Jesus, when he came back in a few forms. He came back as an environmentalist, as a gardener. He came back as a food justice advocate, a cook. He came back as one of us. But really, when I was thinking of this sermon, I thought of that classic labor anthem. You don't hear it much anymore. But I heard it. I was lucky enough as a very little kid to hear Paul Robeson sing it. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. But Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, said he. I never died, said he. It was written by Alfred Hayes, but for some of us, we remember it being sung by Joan Baez or Pete Seeger. Joe was a coal miner, he was a union organizer, and he was executed because of that in the US for his involvement. But he turns up everywhere people are struggling for justice. Joe is there. And one of the lines from that song that rings true for Remembrance Day is this one: "It takes more than guns to kill a man," or crucifixion, we say. In Jesus' day, Sadducees, and we heard this very strange biblical passage, followed the Torah. That was the first 5 books of the Bible, and they did not believe in a resurrection. They didn't have a lot of truck with the prophets and the psalmists. The Pharisees, however, and in this passage it's interesting, Jesus absolutely situates himself as a Pharisee. The Pharisees did consider the Psalms and the prophets critical, and they did believe in the resurrection. And this is a wonderful passage because it's a theological debate. And it shows really that there are lots of ways of reading the Bible that are correct. And there are also lots of ways of reading the Bible that are completely wrong. Now, when I was a little kid, I didn't realize I was a Sadducee, but I was. I was a pint-sized Sadducee because I was what was called back then a midlife baby. My mother was in her 40s. My eldest brother is 18 years older than me. And so she and my parents were a lot older than my friends' parents. And I guess that's why I was kind of a bit obsessed with death and worried about them. But when I thought about heaven, I didn't grow up in a religious household, when I thought about the afterlife, I knew exactly what I wanted to see. I wanted to see exactly what I already experienced as a child. I didn't want anything to change. I wanted my house on Bedford Road, and I wanted the annex. Heaven to me was the annex. Now, I wasn't a big fan of school. School could go, but the annex, that was heaven in my estimation, and everything would continue just the way it always was forever. But I was a Sadducee, and I had some issues because I started thinking about what that meant. And I thought, well, there were people that lived in our house before us, and if they also come back, then it's going to get really crowded really fast. And not only that, but if there are billions of people that have ever lived, and the billions of people all come back at once, then heaven's going to be incredibly crowded. And how will we ever find the ones that we love and lost? Will there be lineups? I pictured heaven as kind of like a government office, you know? It's amusing because I imagine in this passage, Jesus kind of chuckles. I see him laughing. I see him thinking, you silly, silly people. Heaven's not like a Middle Eastern village with women used as chattel, by the way, passed from brother to brother, any more than heaven is like the annex. That's not what it's about. Some quotes come to mind. Susan Ertz, who said, "Millions long for immortality who don't know what to do with themselves on a rainy Sunday afternoon." Or more critically, like Jesus, when Billy Shakespeare penned, "There are more things in heaven and earth," Horatio, "than are dreamt of in your philosophy." Or Antoine Lavoisier, who said in the first law of thermodynamics, "Matter can neither be created nor destroyed." or this is my favorite, probably wrongly attributed to Yogi Berra, but this is a quote: "In theory, there is no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is." Haggai, our prophet, was an eternal optimist. And basically what he's saying in that passage is this. He's saying, build the temple as if it's going to last forever, and you're going to live forever. Build the temple as if God will shake all the nations so there's nothing but joy and treasure and splendor and prosperity. Build the temple as if you weren't living under occupation. Build a temple as if heaven was here and heaven is promised there. Live as if it mattered. Live with purpose, as if you were called into building the temple. I like also the quote from Mark when Jesus is resurrecting this child, and the child's parent says, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." Isn't that just us struggling with this issue? I do believe, but sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes I don't get that we're resurrection people, and I can't really visualize eternity. Like those Canadians, many of them teenagers who died by the thousands taking Vimy Ridge in 1917, whether their love was ultimately in vain or not, the fault of it all lay with those men in power, not with them. We recognize that each one of them was a child made in the image of God who did what they believed was right. Those who love them, and tomorrow in silence, many millions to a century later, will acknowledge their sacrifice and their loss and pledge that no generation will ever have to die that way. And closer to the present, for those of us who this time of year are very aware of our own losses and our own hopes and our own mortalities, in our moments of silence too, we'll promise anew to have a faith in resurrection. We are promised nothing less than eternal life. Yes, we are. Yes, we are. That's what we're promised. Now, we don't have any idea what that looks like. How could we? How could we? Martin Luther called our reasoning faculties hoar reason because it leads us astray into arrogance, he thought. Drop the arrogance. Drop the reason just for a minute. Build the temple as if. Believe in resurrection and believe that our God is a God of the living, not the dead. That's it. And in those moments when you are called to share your belief, and it's never perfect, it's always, Lord, help my unbelief, with a dying child, or a parent sitting next to a dying child, or a martyr giving their life for a larger cause, or someone who's suffering, what will you say but that? We are a resurrection people, and we are promised eternal life. That's what you say. That's what you say. It's not about our ego. We're not the same people we were when we were 8 or 18. It's not about our ego living endlessly on, that much we know. But we do know it's the promise. Share the promise. And one day, we will say, like Joe Hill and Jesus, to someone who notices, they never really left. We'll say then, fear not, I never died. To all those young people who died so long ago and in so many wars, they never died either. We are an eternity people. We are destined for heaven. This is our sure and certain hope. Oh, yes.